Today, we have with us during this session, Senator Julia Kirt, and I'm just going to read the bio that you sent us, if that's all right. So Senator Julia Kirt was elected to the Oklahoma State Senate in 2018, representing District 30 in Northwest Oklahoma City. She is an experienced community leader who has led statewide arts and culture nonprofit organizations for almost 20 years. As a mom of two, Senator Kirt knows firsthand the value of investments we make in public education and in the economy that provides opportunity for all families. Senator Kirt currently serves as a co-chair for the Mental Health Caucus, the Women's Caucus, and the Waiting List Caucus. Her committee work is largely focused on the state's finances and the rules by which our government operates, which allows her work for an Oklahoma built on fairness, where each person and community has what they need to thrive. I know, Senator Kirt, you were asking for this to be really some back and forth dialogue. I'm going to give you the floor and let you speak and share. And from what I understand, you are out with your children tonight, right? So, so we know that you have a life outside of
Right.
the Capitol.
I can always say yes to speaking engagements as long as it doesn't mess anyone else's schedule up, you know how that is. But I'm in the Y, so you might see people jog by, but we'll see. Is the sound okay? Okay, good. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here tonight. And I saw the agenda and it looks like an amazing bunch of presenters. So I'm sure that you all have things to contribute on this topic. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about my background and my experience of advocacy in the Capitol, and then we can see what issues you want to discuss. So I'm just glad to be here. I was elected in 2018. My career mostly was working with artists across the state. So I worked with individual visual artists and then also arts educators, trying to help them make their work thrive in this state and be a part of their community. So I worked statewide for almost 20 years and really fell in love with just the potential of our state, getting to travel around and see people in every county that were doing great things for their community. Really solidified my love of the state and what I thought was possible. But over time, I got really interested in, what is the context that allows people to thrive? And specifically in my work, it was about creative people. How do we help creatives stay here in the state? How do we help them, try to find audiences and make great things happen? And then over time, I just got more interested in the background of that. What is it about our state that lets people be self-employed? What is it about our education system that helps people explore their love and their interests? And that really led me into working in advocacy. And over time, my kids are in Oklahoma City Public Schools. And I got very involved as a parent advocate within the school system during my kids' time. My son is 14, my daughter's 10. My son, before he reached third grade, the Reading Sufficiency Act changed at least 3 times. Any of you who are educators live this, but this whole idea of policy changing my kid's life was very clear to me as I watched that program. Both my kids are on IEPs. My son's on autism spectrum and my daughter has dyslexia. So I've really gotten to know what are the resources in our schools. As we were going through budget failures and ongoing crisis of not paying our teachers sufficiently, they cut the reading specialist from my kid's school. You can imagine how personally I took that. They cut art educator, which our school rose up and really fought for every kid in our district to have access to the arts. And those are the things that start to give you an understanding of resources that aren't there that should be. And I started asking why and trying to help organize other parents to go speak to legislators who kept saying it was beyond their control. Any of you who've been in the legislature talking to legislators, that's sometimes a tactic that elected officials take, which is basically like, oh, I don't think there's anything I can do about that. But I just tell you that that's not the case. And, of course, we saw what happened when the teacher walkout finally was coming and pending, and how much they decided to move mountains to finally make some real budget agreement to improve the resources for schools. It shouldn't take that level of crisis to get us there, but that's really what got me knee deep into advocacy. over time, I got interested in the idea that maybe I would run for office someday, and got kind of pushed into it when my predecessor, who is David Holt, he's now the mayor of Oklahoma City, he told me that he was leaving, and it had been around the time that I'd opened the door to possibly running someday. So I jumped into it, and I spent about 18 months campaigning. And part of that was just going door to door and listening to people. So I got to see Emily Scott on her door. I got to see a bunch of people on their door, and really getting to hear people's stories and family stories is part of what started to introduce me to concerns for individuals who were waiting on the waiting list and who were caring for family members, whether they were folks on the Advantage waiver or folks who had community-based waivers. You know, during the budget crisis, there was a short time where we thought some of those things were even going to get canceled, and that provider rates were getting cut. Literally, while I was knocking doors, I talked to a family that just broke down because they didn't know what they would do if that funding got cut. And so it gave me that really strong insight into what caregivers were facing and what individuals with disabilities were facing in our state. And so I think I started my legislative career with that in mind, and got introduced to the waiting list public meetings early on, and just got to hear the challenges of bureaucracy and policies that weren't serving people well, and definitely lit a fire under me to get involved and try to be involved with solutions and resources. When I got into the legislature, I got to get involved with the waiting list caucus, which is actually a caucus of legislators who come together to try to address the challenge of the waiting list and getting people the services they need. You know, getting involved with other legislators to try to champion an issue is really important. But it only happened because I had constituents and other individuals tell me what a problem it was. And so I bring that up just to say that your story matters, and whether you've been involved already or not, you don't have to know everything about how the legislature runs to be a good advocate. Those people who took the time when I was on their doorstep to really tell me what they were facing and how much the state policies were challenging them, that made a huge difference for me understanding that there was an issue, right? And they very easily could have just blown me off or ignored it, but instead they really expressed to me what their concerns were. So I started in office with a better understanding of the issue because of knowing a few people's stories, and those stories matter. Now I'm on several caucuses. I'm involved with, we just launched a mental health caucus that's specifically looking at, you know, getting the resources and the policies in place that we need to help serve brain health across the state. We've been one of the least funded and least emphasized in the state. So we have a long way to go, but I've been amazed at what a bipartisan issue that is. I feel like people have come a long way because of all the advocates. Some of you may have been those advocates. But I know that people had to fight and push for people to have any understanding of mental health and how it affects families, how it affects our communities, and as well as the individuals. So I really got involved with that one because of stories from the doors as well, from people in neighborhoods telling me what mattered. So, and then the other big thing I'm involved with is the budget. So when I came into office, I just recognized that the budget's the biggest thing we do each year. The legislature has the authority to decide all the appropriations. Agencies make presentations to us about what they want. The governor sets out a dream, and the governor has to sign off on the budget unless we override a veto. But the legislature really holds the purse strings. And so I wanted to dig in and understand that as much as possible, because a lot of what I hear from agencies and from individuals is budgets. That if there's not enough money put towards something, it causes all kinds of limitations and challenges. So I've just immersed myself in it over time. I hope that allows me to be a better advocate within, champion within for those things that I think are important priorities. Anytime we say there's not money for something, it's a decision we've made to prioritize something else. And that's what I've learned by being on the Appropriations Committee, the Finance Committee. When I was assigned to the Finance Committee, I really thought it was going to be all about taxes and bringing in money to the state, but it's actually almost entirely about tax credits and deductions and exemptions. So we're actually reducing the amount of money that comes into the state. And so we make decisions there's votes every meeting that we have that gives money away, whether it's to a business interest or an industry or nonprofit. And of course, some of those have merit, but I'm just saying that we make decisions all the time to spend money or to forgo revenue at the state. And it's a priority that we make, that we decide what gets that money. You know, I was going to tell you just a couple of things over the last few years where advocates have made a big difference in my experience. Trying to think of things that would be relevant. Certainly in terms of policies, I've seen the work that advocates have done. Certainly Autism Foundation's work and others to make sure that insurance coverage for the needs of children, private insurance getting mandated to do something, that's a big change. It's very hard to push through the folks that don't want to have to cover things that cost them money. But that's a huge difference that it's making for families that now can access care that they need. Likewise, we make rules about, sometimes it's statutes and sometimes it's in rules, what is spent out of Medicaid money. So I had a really specific instance. Anytime a constituent contacts me, I try to figure out, is it just a single problem or is it a system problem? Because I don't want to just solve something just for one person. You should not have to call your legislator to get an answer from DHS on a problem you have, or to call your legislator because the healthcare authority won't get back to you on something. But this does happen, and some of you may have experienced that, where you're just so desperate that you finally call your legislator to say, how can you help with this? And as you can imagine, we can get answers sometimes faster. So for instance, I had a foster parent reach out to me who is a therapeutic foster home. She specifically told me that she was having problems because they stopped covering the cost of gloves, rubber gloves, which when I first got the email, I was just so confused what was going on. And they also stopped paying the mileage that she used to get a reimbursement for mileage. She had to take her foster child to a doctor's appointment that was far away, and they reduced the mileage that got paid. And so these were huge issues to her. You know, here they have this family that's taken in therapeutic foster children, and they weren't getting the help that they needed. And so when we reached out to the healthcare authority and to DHS, what we found out was that they had actually changed who funded it. They moved it from DHS to the healthcare authority, and they just had misinterpreted a rule that was from the federal government. And so it was really this wonderful thing where a constituent reaching out to me about something that was a big deal to her allowed us to fix a problem for a bunch of parents. So a lot of foster families who were affected by this, they fixed the policy. And that's like an amazing, that's the best possible scenario, is that we're able to fix the problem rather than having to write a law or change statutes in order to get relief for someone. But I'm sure she must have been at her wit's end by the time she wrote me a long email about that. And I'm sorry that she had to go through all that. But I think that's where advocacy comes in. And it's even better if you already have a relationship with the legislator. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So we do get contacted by a lot of different people in a lot of different groups. I think you'd actually be surprised. I don't think the volume's near what I expected. When I was an advocate, I thought that all the legislators were flooded with messages all the time. And I don't find that that's the case. We get a lot of messages around certain hot button issues, but there are hundreds and hundreds of bills that come through our chamber each year that no one chimes in on. And I know part of that is because it's hard to know what's happening in the legislature. It's hard to keep up, frankly, even when you're inside the building, it's hard to keep up. But I'll just say that, you know, there's many issues where we don't hear from folks. And of course, the Capitol being closed has made it harder for anyone to visit, but we used to be able to get more groups visiting. But it makes a huge difference when we hear from people on issues that matter to them. And with the volume of bills and issues that are coming through and the voices that are being heard, it really matters to know you have a constituent who cares or is affected by an issue. When you see the various pressures, you know, I'll tell you one of the weirdest things that I never knew is how hard it is to vote no. I really thought, you know, my former activist self really thought it'd be easy to go in and just vote no all the time. but it's personal to my colleagues if I vote against their bill. And so I really find that I have to have a reason, a clear reason to vote no on things, unless it's just straight up unethical or unconstitutional in my view. So for instance, if it's an issue I don't know a whole lot about, and I'm trying to rely on my colleagues for assistance, but if a constituent reaches out to me and says, this is a really bad idea for this reason, or I really have a problem with this, that helps say no to things that are not good policy. And I know that's kind of exhausting for those who are real adamant advocates who are up there all the time, but there's a real challenge to building relationships with other legislators. So we have to be careful about how much we're throwing up protest votes, if that makes sense. So your voices matter within that. In terms of getting to know folks, and I'll in a minute look forward to hearing what you're interested in talking about, but just as a reminder, there's 48 senators. We each serve 4-year terms. Half the Senate is up for election every other year. So there's 48 of us, 24 up for election, and then 24 2 years after that. So we kind of rotate. In the House of Representatives, there's 101 representatives, and they get elected every 2 years. They represent about 36,000 people. We represent about 83,000 people. And but you really do not hear from that many people. So when you hear that, oh, you represent 83,000 people, you think I'm getting flooded. But within that, you can just think how few people are really engaged and know what's going on at the state capitol at any given day. So it's a considerably fewer people. But we serve on committees. We're assigned to those committees. Much of the legislature runs on the leadership. So whichever party has the majority gets to assign the leadership. So the Republican Party is in the majority by far right now. And so they elected the pro tem of the Senate is Greg Treat from Northwest Oklahoma City, Deer Creek and Edmond. He gets to lead the entire unit on the House side. It's the Speaker of the House is Charles McCall from Atoka. Those folks really get to lead and make a lot of the rules. We function as a body on rules, and some of them can seem kind of arcane or weird, but they're really about trying to make sure that we have fair decision-making processes. Some things are not as fair, but I'll just say that, for instance, there's a time when we can all ask questions. There's times when we get acknowledged. So even if you're in the minority party, you should have a say of some sort within things. But I just say that to point out that leadership makes a huge difference on who gets to do what within the Senate. They make all the difference in terms of who gets to hear bills, which bills get heard. They make all the difference in terms of the budget decision making. The rest of us all have a voice, but it's very much led by the leadership of the Senate and the House. We are officially a part-time legislature, so we meet from February to May. The governor does a State of the State in January, or the first Monday in February. So that's officially when we start. The rest of the year is really about preparation and meetings. We do have several standing committees that get together. So for instance, right now we're going through redistricting, which is where our maps get redrawn from the census. And so there's a committee that has to meet now about that. And we're doing these things right now called Interim Studies. That's really just a hearing opportunity. It's a way for legislators to draw attention to a topic or have experts speak. The way that our legislature runs, we don't have opportunities for public input in a public way. Any of you who've watched committee meetings and had an opinion about a topic it's probably been hard because testimony is only very rarely allowed by outside people, and that's decided by the committee chairs. So if an issue comes up, they could choose to invite someone to speak, but it's very rare. It's almost always just the senators speaking in those meetings. So we don't let the public speak. Their only opportunity for advocacy is directly to us or to the, in communications. So interim studies is the one chance really in the year that's focused more on having experts come and tell us what's up. And I wish we had a whole lot more public involvement, but that's another topic entirely. Just a few remarks on getting to know legislators, and then I guess first I should just say why I think it's important. Having a relationship with someone makes a huge difference in terms of being heard well. And I know that that can be, for me, when I didn't know legislators, I found that pretty intimidating because it seemed like a big task. But I'll just say, even getting to know your House member, your Senate member can make a huge difference on helping advocacy messages come across, helping your family, helping the agency that you need them to change policies, change directions, or do their job, do those things. And by you being friends, or at least having a regular contact with your legislator, they know who you are, and they know that if they vote against your interests, that you're watching. And the reason I say that is there are a lot of people who scrutinize the process up close. Many of those are for-profit entities. So we have associations and businesses who have lobbyists who are speaking out. But there are other types of public groups that are there as well. But a lot of the voices are commercial interests. So, for instance, in the example that Emily could probably give you the whole rundown of fighting for coverage, there are multiple paid lobbyists in the building for the insurance industry. And so these are people who specifically are trying to advocate to make it cheaper to do business a lot of times. And so to get through that hurdle, you have to have a lot of the public's voice, to hear them, to trust that that's needed, and to get over the usually dire predictions made by the lobbyists about what's going to happen with some kind of change. The best way to get to know people is just like you would with friends. I mean, the very best is to invite them to something or to get together with them face to face. I know in the time of COVID, that's not ideal. But over time, if there's something you can invite them to, an event or activity, that's fabulous. Legislators like to go do community events. Or if you can invite them to coffee or just a chance to meet with them. It's even better if it's in your district, so you don't have to come to the state capitol for that meeting. A lot of the legislators, the ones that live outside the Oklahoma City metro, are not up at the Capitol consistently. I'm one of the closest to the Capitol, so for me, that's easy. But for other people, they have to travel quite a ways. So inviting them to do something back home, wherever you are, makes the most sense. So that's the best. The next would be phone. Even if you can schedule a phone chat, just to tell them about yourself. I had a few people right after I got elected do that. And it was so helpful. I had an accountant who just has a lot of opinions about accountant policy. And he just called and said, he set up a meeting. We talked for 15 minutes on the phone. And he just told me his background. He told me the kinds of things that he watches at the legislature. And he just said, if you have questions about accounting policy, if you have issues around this, please call me. I care. I'm going to be watching. And so I had the same thing happen with educators and several other professions. So I knew that they cared and they were watching. And that helps me not only have a resource person I can call on, but it also is like in my mind that, oh, they're going to be watching if I make this vote. So I better make sure I'm informed before I vote on this. If you can't make time for phone or in person, certainly email works. I just encourage you to be yourself. We do get quite a few emails that are copied and pasted, and it makes a difference, even if it's super short, if it's just you and your own words telling something. And certainly email, if you're being ignored by your legislator, we can talk about strategies for that, but your legislator should be responsive to your requests if you live in their district. And just for quick background, because I'm not sure in terms of experience level for everyone, you can look up your legislator at oksenate.gov or okhouse.gov by putting in your address, and there you can find them. And not to get too confusing, but they will change next year with the new redrawn maps. Folks in rural areas and urban areas, about a third of people are going to get new legislators because of the change in our demographics. Everybody moving to the city. But you can find them on the website. You can send them a letter. You can send them an email. But I just encourage you, if you can, take the time to call or see them in person. And don't view it as something where you have to talk to someone all the time. I think even one call in the off session, one email in the off session can be a way to build that introduction, so that when you're calling them and saying vote no on something, it's not the very first time they've ever heard from you. It really makes a difference if they already know something about your background and something about you constructively. if you're going to critique what they're up to. I encourage you also, some people are experts in this field. And for those who are sophisticated about how the legislature runs, great. But you do not have to know how everything runs or what the budget is to advocate. I used to do this with arts educators and artists, trying to get them to speak to their legislators about what they cared about. And they always wanted to know all the statistics about the whole state. And they wanted to know, you know, all about educational requirements or the budget. And I just said, look, you are not there to be the statewide representative of the entire industry. You're there to tell your story. Here's who I am. Here's what affects me. Here are the problems I'm having with state services or state priorities. And let it really be about you. And don't feel like you have to be someone who knows everything, right? I will just briefly say that I've had the experience, and I've had friends with the experience of legislators that are dismissive to them. Have any of you all experienced that? No, never, right? Okay, so, you know, I would wish that all my colleagues would be as dedicated to listening to their constituents, but they just aren't always, and I can't explain it. I don't know what they're thinking, and I don't know where they're spending their time. But if you're a constituent of someone who's regularly ignoring you, you can make sure to not, number one, during campaign season, you need to let them know that that's not all right. During campaign season, they're actually thinking about their voters, and that does matter. The other thing is to invite them to public things. So if you're having a problem with them interacting with you one-on-one, can you invite them to something where it's a larger group, or there's other folks involved, so they take you more seriously within a group. Sometimes it might be a lost cause. We had a legislator that just kept lying to our parents when they went. And they would say, no, this is what's happening in Oklahoma City Public Schools. This is what we're experiencing. And he would just say, no, that's not happening. And, you know, if someone straight is upfront ignoring your whole perspective, I think the only way to deal with that is to not vote for them, number one, and number two, bring them in a public forum if you can, so that they're speaking where they're going to get corrected. But a lot of times I find that people are receptive. The only thing is there's tight time, so it's pretty hard for people to spend much time. So those are the two big things I wanted to mention. Is just, I think, your story and talking about what are those barriers you're facing or things that other people might not know. And I think coming from a very specific background, so I was a nonprofit leader and I worked in the arts, you get kind of a tunnel vision for what you know and what you know is important. But not everyone knows the challenges you're facing. And I think it does take you really spelling out for folks what you're seeing if you're a self-advocate, what you're seeing as barriers or challenges if you're a caregiver. Spelling out what that means, because if people haven't actually had to do that, they might not have an experience to understand what's going on. Just don't assume that we know and understand. And the other thing I would mention is that I'm surprised at my short-term memory loss in the legislature because of the volume of information we get. So I do think it's worth reintroducing yourself and re-explaining issues. So some people figure out how to do that pretty quickly, and that's good. But I think sometimes it can be confusing after it's been a year or two. So my big encouragement is just to start and not try to have the perfect method or the perfect strategy or the perfect reason to reach out, but instead to have it just be something where you know that these people are impacting. I mean, we are, as legislators, we're deciding how money gets spent on schools, on transition services, on Medicaid. We're making those decisions every year. We make decisions, policy decisions that affect all of our families, and we're setting priorities that matter. So, you know, everything can't change overnight, but you absolutely can push for what you think is important. So my main message is just to be, I hope you feel empowered to speak up, whether you know a lot or not about how the state's functioning now. I wanted to open it up. You guys could do in the chat or you could unmute, but who here, just give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, who here feels pretty confident in terms of talking with a legislator? Give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, or in between. Yeah, that's okay. It's okay. Thumbs down, yeah. Got a couple thumbs up, couple thumbs down. I hear you. I mean, I'm telling you, before I arrived in the legislature, I would have given myself a thumbs down. So it takes quite a bit of practice to feel confident about it, but I think that's okay. I mean, any elected official, if they're rude to you, I put it on them, because to me, when someone comes into my office or calls me, they don't always know exactly what they're asking for or what they need, but it's my job to connect the dots, right? So if you're having a problem and I can't connect the dots, that's really my job. So I'd be curious to see, are there specific issues you guys are wanting to consider for advocacy? Are there specific things that are hot on your mind right now?
First, of my organization and myself personally, I am interested in law enforcement training for autism and other developmental cognitive disabilities. That's really an important issue for us because we see such a disparity there. And we also are interested in advocating for more post-secondary education opportunities for the autism community and developmental disabilities. So those are our big ones that we're looking at. And we have an advocacy and awareness committee, and you're welcome to join anytime.
Well, so that's interesting. Like, as soon as Emily says that, I think about both the positive and constructive things they can advocate for, and then also things that they need to be watching out for. So one thing, when you started talking about the law enforcement training, I've been really concerned. They're looking at decentralizing more of the law enforcement training. So changing, we have a model now called CLEAT, where all certain law enforcement folks have to go through the same training. And that gives us an ability to set in statute, you have to know these things. So for instance, they added a module specifically about domestic abuse, because we had a real challenge with law enforcement not understanding domestic abuse when they respond to it, mental health, etc. And so CLEAT is the best avenue for something like requiring training related to autism and other disabilities. And if they start to decentralize law enforcement, it depends on who's teaching it, right? And that makes me really nervous. I think sometimes there's things where the state should centralize, and there's sometimes where decentralizing is good, but that's one that worries me if we don't have consistency across the state in terms of helping training. That's huge.
Yeah. And just one last quick thought on that. So last year, CLEAT asked the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health to sort of be the gatekeeper for what would be required for mental health hour trainings. That's one of those mandates that you just talked about. And for a long time, autism was counting as that, but now it's not. And so we know of a trainer who is providing autism training, but officers have stopped taking the training because it doesn't count toward their mental health hours. So, you know, we're doing some interagency advocacy to try to change that and get them to see that no one calls the cops on a person having autism. They call because the person with autism is having likely a mental health crisis. But then we're also concerned about exactly what you just talked about, the decentralization. What will that mean? Will we then, you know, we talked about possibly looking at a mandate for training similar to the mental health hours, but now with this, it's hard to know what to do.
Yeah, good point. And I think that what you're talking about, the interagency, I mean, when you identify a problem, and Emily knows how to do this because she's done it quite a bit, but to analyze, not everything needs a law change, and changing a law is probably the hardest thing most of the time, unless there's, you know, real barriers at the agencies you're working with. But, you know, that ability to change something at the agency rule level, or to raise a concern like, you've created this, but you've forgotten this whole section. You know, decisions like that about what counts as continuing education, that makes a huge difference on what our doctors are learning, what our lawyers are learning. And that's something that can be done in the law and statute, but a lot of times it's done by boards. And so you don't always have to speak directly to legislators, but that might be an avenue. And the other thing I'll mention, which I know I've seen the Autism Foundation do this, but if you see issues that you think can be affected on a local level. It's so much easier to change things on a local level with our local law enforcement, with our local education systems, and then to move it up to state or federal when you have to. And I think that that's ideal if we can start with the local. And Jen, I see your question. So Jen thought she'd raise one. I like that, the quirky one. She said, what about lowering the voting age to 16? You know, I was in an interim study where they talked about this, and I cannot remember what the research was, but they just brought it up as speculative. I think it's Senator Mary Bourne is very interested in younger people being able to vote because she thinks it would engage them earlier. She was looking at just trying to get young people able to serve as poll workers. I guess we have an age limit for poll workers, and we have a real shortage of poll workers. And that would sure be a upfront way for people to get involved with the voting system. But I don't know. I think that's, we really don't know how to treat the folks between about 16 and 24. It seems like we sometimes treat them as children, sometimes treat them as adults that should already have it all figured out, right? Be an interesting conversation. Other issues you guys want to talk about? You may be tired of talking about DDS services, but I'll just briefly speak about it. And it may be something you've already talked about today, so tell me if I'm repeating too much territory. But I think you know that there's an ongoing challenge with not having sufficient resources for services for home and community-based waivers. There's a push in the legislature that's led by the Republican leadership to come up with a number that would fund eliminating the wait list. And so, you know, advocacy right now has been a lot about how do we make sure that it's not about just taking people off a list, but it's making sure people are getting services. And that's taken a lot of different avenues. I'll tell you, you know, that any of you who watched, there was a bill that came up this year that required a 5-year delay when somebody moved to Oklahoma before they could get on the wait list. And according to the folks we talked to who were running the bill, they just couldn't believe that there was an uproar about it. They were in shock. And I said to them, clearly you didn't talk to families to ask them what they thought about it, because everyone who's in that world saw the hazards of that for their own family that might have a need to live somewhere else or a need to come back to be near family, but also empathy for others in the same situation of seeking services. And so that was a really strange process where a bill literally was filed late the night before it was going to be voted on. And we were trying to get an analysis of what the impact would be. Disability Law Center and some other groups were very good at getting us information quickly. The ARC, but we were texting people at 10 p.m. trying to figure out what was going on. Unfortunately, that bill did pass. And I think that any of you who care about that should remind your legislators who voted for it that that was an okay and that they need to listen to you. I think it's actually an opportunity. You don't have to scold them, but you know, in debate and in questions, many of us raised constitutional concerns, raised concerns about compassion for people in our midst who need help, and some of the concerns about caregivers where using language that belittles caregivers can be very troubling. I think that this is a teachable moment for legislators who voted for that bill to tell them they need to listen better, and just to say, I know you voted for this. I don't know what was going on in your caucus, because probably the caucus said you need to vote for this. And I need you to listen to me. I need you to call me when you see things that are affected by this. I need you to hear me when I tell you something is unconstitutional or not compassionate. I know that I'm trying to pump myself up to do the same with my colleagues, to not say, I told you so, I told you that was unconstitutional, but instead to take a more positive, because you can choose a couple of tacks as an advocate. You can be, you can burn bridges pretty fast, and you certainly can choose to do that. I think there's a real value in the people who are very pure and clear, but you can also choose to let things be a teachable moment and to help them know, here's why that was a bad idea, and here's why I hope you'll reach out to me next time before you vote on something like this. And I think also, as we see that relationship, there's a strange relationship between the agencies who implement policy and the legislators. So sometimes they're really aligned, sometimes they're in opposition. And this was one where DHS wanted this bill, and the legislature agreed with them. So, I just say use it as a moment to teach others about it, and to know that things come up at the last minute. It can be really disheartening, but I just love that the system worked, that by questioning the legality of that bill, we were able to find out, no, you can't implement that. So I hope we can use that as a way to get more folks listened to on an ongoing basis. Anyway, that was kind of a sideline. Other issues you guys want to talk about?
I would just kind of like to ask a question. My daughter has cystic fibrosis, and so, and she's just now 2, and so we're just now starting out in this, world of disability and learning about it, and why legislation can be so important for her now and later in life. And what advice would you give to a parent who is just learning about this stuff? Like, where do we look to find, what legislation could possibly affect us, or, anything like that? Like, somebody who's just now getting their feet wet in it and wants to learn more about it, what advice would you give to a parent like that?
Well, first of all, I'd say watch your advocacy organizations. So those organizations, watch closely. So the ARC, Autism Foundation's on it for much legislation, but they are doing a good job of staying up on the issues. So any of the associations who have a presence at the Capitol, rely on them, because they're also really good about, folks who are up there a lot start to figure out how to separate the things that will never get heard, that will never happen, from the things that are really a threat. So it can be kind of scary if you care about a certain issue. There's 2,000 bills filed a year. Of those, the governor signed something like 500 last year, which is a record. So that the majority of bills are not going to go anywhere. But as an advocate, it's hard to know that. So I'll never forget the first bill that I helped, try to get grassroots advocates out about, was a bill to merge 2 agencies that we weren't okay with. We just raised the red flag and, had people across the state freaking out about it. And we inundated this poor guy that ran the bill, who now is I think a much more reasonable guy. He didn't know at the time, but we didn't realize his bill was never going to get heard. He was like a freshman. He didn't have any clout. Anyway, but the advocacy groups could help with that. And so number one, I say, don't expect that you have to be the expert on that. The second thing, I think immediately when you say that, it makes me think of, I think Wanda Felty's really good about this in the waiting list meetings, pointing out, where are you as a parent when you get a diagnosis? And I think sometimes on our end as a policymaker, we don't always know what you're facing. So for instance, the fact that you might have 5 different health-related things you're having to process simultaneously, and special information from the school district, the volume of forms and information that you're being flooded with. I think just that story from you, I just think it'd be amazing if you just said, here's where I am now, here's what I know about my kid and the barriers she's facing. Here's the state services we're interacting with right now, and here's some things that are going poorly or well. I think if you would do that once a year, you would truly map out for a legislator to understand better what parents face when they are learning and trying to raise their kid and getting their kid to start school, or whatever it is you're facing. I know it's so different when they're school age, when they're dealing with early services, and I think if you even just talked about that, I think that'd be meaningful. I know at the waiting list meetings, my eyes start to just roll in my head with the volume of entities and agencies that you can get resources from. It can be very overwhelming to highlight what you should get to, right? So I think even helping them understand that would be meaningful, and what you're facing, what that experience is of having a diagnosis, and what those worries are for your kid. And you're worried that whether it's like with my son, I worry is the school system going to beat him down? Is he going to lose all confidence and hope? Or is he going to find a path somehow through this? Or whatever those worries that you have going forward that really the state does impact. I encourage you just to start there, and be available to your association. If they need you, if they say to you, call, because they're not going to ask for grassroots for folks to call in or email in if it's not an emergency, because they would tire you out. So those are my first things, but I think your story matters. I think, and gosh, through COVID, I just can't believe how little I've seen the challenges for your family to keep your loved one well through COVID. And I think there's been a lack of compassion for that challenge for many of my colleagues. So anyway, I encourage that. Yay, Oklahoma Parent Centers. You guys are awesome. I think, when there's so many things on your plate, it can be really hard to prioritize advocacy, but I just know that it can make a big impact with one story, one relationship. I've watched what happened, just so happens, for instance, one of the Republican legislators who's really taking the lead on wanting to help address the waiting list has a grandson with autism, and he cares more. He just, having that personal connection matters to him. Other people, it's because they learned from a constituent who, John Eccles, Representative Eccles, became an advocate for the waiting list because Aaron Taylor wouldn't let it rest. So one mother who just said, you're going to care about this. I'm not going to let you forget that this is important, right? And so she probably started when he was a freshman legislator, and then he became the floor leader. And the floor leader is the person who decides where bills go and what gets heard from day to day. So the fact that she made that relationship early on has literally led to millions of dollars towards services. And it may not always have that big an impact, but just know that it can, and it should have that kind of impact.
Do we have time?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes.
So just something that you had said and something that I've been thinking about, and now I'm like, hadn't thought about that. So I'm in a new role with the Developmental Disabilities Council, trying to fill the shoes of Ann Trudgeon as their new director. And something you said, I was like, never thought about going to introduce myself to the legislators. Do you think that would, just so they'll know that we're here to help? Would that be, in person would be better with like maybe something that just said a summary of who we are?
Oh yeah, that'd be huge. I think the fact that you're new is such a great opportunity to reestablish relationships. And
Right.
Someone may have known your predecessor, someone may know some board
Right.
members. If you can get some board members to go with you, that's even better probably. But
Okay.
absolutely, I think that's totally worth it. And I wouldn't set a goal to meet 149 legislators, because that's just way too much. And they probably won't all make the time, right? But if you started with, okay, I want to meet Health and Human Services Committee and then Judiciary Committee, like just set a group that you really hope that you get to meet, I think that would be worthwhile.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, for sure. And we do have a lot of circumstances where we don't know who to ask. Like I have this, there's no way for me to make an effective database or Rolodex of resource people. And we've tried, my executive assistant we have one staff member as a legislator. She's tried really hard to create information sources where we can tag people well. But it's hard to figure out who to ask or who to send our voters to. So constituents call us with problems. And a lot of times we're like, well, I don't know who to tell you to go to. But if we have an idea this is a great place for folks to go. I have promoted your programs many times, because I think it's such a great resource for people in our community. And I think that's another great asset of legislators. They tend to be pretty well connected because they have to be. If they're in a small town, they tend to know everybody. And so it can be a good way to introduce your issue or your concern to a broader audience there too.
Cool.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's worthwhile.
Thanks.
Yeah. I think you can't see everybody at once, but to add a few people a year for sure, I think it's worthwhile. And I just encourage you, all of you are, I hope, registered to vote. If you're not registered, get registered. Next general election cycle is November of 22. And I'll just say, I know this may sound cynical, but truly people listen better during election year because they're just having to pay more attention to what their community thinks. So if somebody ever knocks on your door who's someone running for office or a volunteer, tell them what's important to you. During my campaign, I knocked on 20,000 doors. I probably only had 30 people really stand there and tell me what they were worried about out of thousands, so it can make a big difference. Or go to one of their events. If you can take the time to go to an elected, have them meet, if you're a caregiver, have them meet your loved one. I think that makes a huge difference for them to put a child's face or adult's face to a challenge, for them to know that someone lives in their district with that. Election year is a great time to be making sure that people know who you are. Well, I really appreciate just this conference. I wish I could do it. Wish I could have come all day, but I did have legislative meetings today. So I'm thrilled to get to be here, and I'm glad to be a resource if you ever have questions. My executive assistant is awesome, Elizabeth. She is very helpful. Like, we've done things with, helping people find their legislators, helping people know what committee does what. And we're glad to do that for anyone who needs orientation. Or if you're not sure, like, how to approach something, like you think something is an issue, but you're not sure who even makes the decision about it. I'm glad to try to help you map that out. Let's see, secondary training. Oh, thank you, Jen. Thanks for mentioning that. So I did get, I'm doing an interim study specifically about transitions for individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities. That will be a hearing. It's either going to be on October 12th or 13th. Still trying to nail down the time. The committee chair has committed to hearing it in the education committee, but I haven't gotten a length yet. So he wants me to give him a speaker's list, and I want him to give me a length before I give him a speaker's list. So we're kind of at a standoff. But I hope that hearing can be a catalyst to helping my colleagues understand what goes on, that transition time when, State Department of Education meets Department of Rehabilitation Services, meets Department of Human Services, etc. A hard time for everyone, no matter what, but add those challenges to the mix. Hopefully we can spell out some of the things that can possibly be improved in the system, and at the very least improve people's awareness. So October 12th and 13th, you can if you'll email me, julia.kirt@oksenate.gov, we'll put you on a list to hear when that's gotten scheduled. If you care about a specific committee, there is a free process on the Oklahoma Legislature website to follow a bill or a committee. Just so you know, if you're just like, oh, I'd like to get those committee announcements so I get a grip, you can choose to, there's an option to subscribe, basically. But I encourage you, no matter what, like, don't let it overwhelm you, and take a step of some sort. If setting up a meeting sounds like too much, send an email. If that sounds like too much, make a quick phone call, but just make sure people know what matters to you, because we are making decisions every day and prioritizing things. But thank you to the Oklahoma Family Network.